The torches flickered in the cold stone corridors, their smoke curling like black ghosts against the walls of an ancient monastery-turned-tribunal. It smelled of wax, blood, and incessant uneasy marriage of the sacred and the profane. Somewhere beyond those walls a bell tolled, heavy and hollow, as if mourning the souls yet to be condemned. They called it the Holy Inquisition. But holiness was not what you would have seen if you stood there in that dim chamber centuries ago. You would have seen fear. You would have smelled it. It seeped from the skin of those dragged before the Inquisitors, men and women, trembling under the gaze of priests who believed they were the hands of God, yet acted as if they were the instruments of hell. What kind of faith turns confession into agony? What kind of church builds salvation on the screams of its own flock? The Inquisition began as a weapon of purity born in the 13th century, when the Catholic Church sought to root out heresy. But purity, once sharpened into a blade, cuts far beyond its purpose. Soon, the sword of faith turned upon anyone who whispered doubt, who read the wrong book, who dreamed of a different truth. In Spain, under the rule of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Inquisition became an empire of terror. The year was 1478. Spain had just emerged from centuries of war with the Moors, and the royal court desired not only a single land, but a single soul. Jews were forced to convert or flee. Muslims hid their prayers behind locked doors, and still, the Inquisition came for them, cloaked in divine authority, armed with the weight of heaven. Picture the tribunal room's vaulted ceilings echoing with Latin chants, the scent of burning tallow candles thick in the air. At the center sat the Inquisitors, black-robed, pale-eyed, their hands resting on books of law bound in human skin. Behind them stood scribes, recording every tremor, every breath, every word. Before them, the accused, a merchant, a healer, a child shaking beneath the shadow of judgment. "Do you deny the faith?" they would ask. But the answer did not matter. Torture was the true sermon of the Inquisition. Iron boots crushed bones. The rack stretched limbs until tendons snapped like harp strings. Strapado lifted bodies into the air, dislocating shoulders with a single twist of the rope. And yet the room was silent, save for the quiet murmur of prayers offered between screams. Those who confessed were promised mercy. But mercy was another word for fire. At dawn, they were led to the auto da, the act of faith. Public burnings became theater, a holy spectacle attended by nobles, peasants, and clergy alike. The condemned were dressed in garments painted with devils and flames, their heads shaved to mark their shame. As the pyres were lit, the crowd sang hymns, their voices rising over the crackle of burning flesh. Imagine the smoke drifting above the city of Seville, darkening the sky, mingling with church bells. Imagine the children watching, believing that this was righteousness. What fear holds more power than one that hides behind salvation? But there was something darker still, something whispered behind closed doors. Some historians speak of secret chambers within the monastery's rooms that never appeared on any map. There, the most dangerous heretics were not merely interrogated. They were experimented upon. Physicians in service to the church used their suffering to study the anatomy of sin, claiming to search for the physical mark of heresy upon the body. It was said they dissected the dead by candlelight, murmuring prayers as if they could sanctify the act. Others tell of strange rituals performed to cleanse the souls of witches, and mystic ceremonies that mixed exorcism with cruelty, where holy water turned to poison and psalms were sung backward in the dark. The church denied these tales, of course. But denial was the very air the Inquisition breathed. And yet, behind the facade of piety, the system thrived on confession, not truth. The more heretics they found, the more gold and power the tribunals gained. Entire families vanished into the prisons beneath the cathedrals, never to be seen again. Some say their bones still lie beneath the stones of Toledo and Granada, buried alongside their confessions. Even the inquisitors themselves were not immune. Suspicion was a fire that devoured all. One word, one rumor, and the hunter could become the hunted. Many died whispering prayers to the same God in whose name they had tortured others. History remembers them as servants of faith. But faith twisted by fear is no longer faith. It is domination. And so, the Inquisition grew into a machine that consumed souls and spat out ashes, its gears turning for nearly 400 years. What was it truly seeking? purity or control? Beneath the cathedral bells, beneath the weight of scripture and sin, something far older than the church itself seemed to awaken a hunger for obedience, masked as salvation. The flames may have died, but the smoke still lingers. And in that smoke, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers of those who were never allowed to speak. Deep beneath the cathedrals of Spain, where light seldom reached, and air hung heavy with mildew and secrets, there were rooms the world was never meant to see. The archives of the Holy Office, hidden behind thick oak doors bound in iron, were said to contain the words of the damned. Testimonies, written in trembling ink, confessions carved into the margins of parchment by desperate hands. Few ever entered these halls, and fewer left unchanged. The inquisitors believed they were documenting evil, but what they preserved was madness. Imagine it, narrow corridors of stone, shelves stretching into darkness, stacked with scrolls, bones, and instruments of faith and fear alike. The candles sputtered against the damp, their flames too weak to chase away the shadows. Each step echoed like a heartbeat, as if the building itself remembered every cry that had ever passed through its walls. What truths were buried here? What confessions so terrible that even the church hid them from the light of day? Some whispered that among those manuscripts were forbidden texts, ancient gospels, not sanctioned by Rome. Heretical knowledge smuggled from Moorish scholars, grimoires said to hold the secrets of life and death. The inquisitors studied them in secret, under the guise of eradicating sin. Yet the more they read, the more they began to resemble the heretics they sought to destroy. A few even claimed to have seen visions, phantoms rising from the ink, faces of those they condemned, accusing them in silence. There are accounts, though never proven, of priests who went mad after spending too long within the archives. Their writings became incoherent, filled with pleas for mercy from voices no one else could hear. What if the Inquisition had become haunted, not by demons from hell, but by the weight of its own sins? In the year 1600, a scholar named Fray Tomás de Landa was brought to these lower vaults. It uncovered something: a series of letters exchanged between inquisitors in Toledo and Rome. They spoke of experiments too blasphemous to name, of relics unearthed during the conquest of the Americas. Among them was said to be a fragment of obsidian, carved with unknown symbols, taken from an Aztec temple and kept beneath the Vatican. The letters claimed it bled when touched by light. De Landa tried to expose it. Within a week, he vanished. The records show he confessed before dawn, though no document of that confession remains. Only his robes, still stained with wax and blood, preserved in a silent drawer. Aside, the world moved on, kings rose and fell, wars burned and faded, but the Inquisition endured. It shifted form, changing faces, spreading through Portugal, Italy, and beyond. What began as religious purification turned into political weaponry. Monarchs learned that fear could rule better than faith, and so they kept the fires burning. In the prisons of Lisbon, prisoners spoke of hearing footsteps in the corridors at night when no guard was near, chains rattled by invisible hands. One man claimed to see his own shadow move before he did, whispering prayers in Latin. When he refused to recant his heresy, they found him dead by morning, a cross carved into his chest not by a knife, but as if seared by unseen flame. The inquisitors recorded it as divine intervention. But faith that feeds on suffering cannot last forever. In time, the Enlightenment dawned, and the world began to awaken from the nightmare. Nations demanded proof, reason, freedom. Yet even as the Inquisition's power waned, it refused to die. The last tribunals limped into the 19th century, long after the world had turned its gaze toward science and progress, and still, in the archives, the candles burned. When Napoleon's soldiers stormed the monasteries of Spain, they discovered rooms sealed for centuries. Inside were racks still stained dark, books bound in human hide, thousands of pages of confessions, signed only with crosses, marks of those who could not write, yet were forced to name themselves guilty. Many of those documents were ordered destroyed, but a few disappeared into private hands. To this day, a handful of scholars claim to have seen fragments, letters written by inquisitors who repented in secret. One described dreams in which the screams of their victims turned into chants, echoing endlessly through cathedral walls. Another confessed that after years of torture, he no longer believed in God at all. Perhaps that was the final punishment, not the fire, not the rack, but the silence that came after. The unbearable quiet of realizing the faith they killed for had turned to ash in their own hands. Centuries have passed, and the Inquisition has become history, a lesson, a warning, a distant shadow. Yet its echo remains in every regime that silences dissent, in every ideology that calls cruelty justice, in every faith that mistakes control for devotion. Because the Inquisition was never just an institution, it was a mirror. And when humanity stares too long into its own fear, that mirror begins to look back. The bells no longer toll in Seville, but sometimes when the night wind passes over the old cathedrals, it carries a faint whisper like parchment turning in the dark. Perhaps the confessions were never burned. Perhaps they are still being written. And perhaps the Inquisition was never truly over. The centuries moved on, but shadows do not age. They only change their shape. When the fires of the Inquisition finally dimmed, the world believed it had awoken from a long and terrible dream. But nightmares do not end when the dreamer opens his eyes. They linger, quietly breathing in the corners of memory. Europe rebuilt itself with cathedrals that still smelled faintly of smoke. Behind their stained-glass beauty lay stones that had heard too much. Monks whispered prayers in echoing cloisters, though many could still feel the ghosts of the condemned kneeling beside them. The Inquisition had left its mark not on walls but on the mind of civilization itself. Fear had learned a new language. Where once priests demanded confession, now kings demanded obedience. The methods changed. The dungeons became courts. The racks became documents. The torches became words, but the purpose remained the same: to break the soul until it bent to authority. Can you imagine what it means to live in a world where every thought is a sin? Those who survived the Inquisition carried its curse within them. Children of the accused grew up with names whispered, not spoken. They buried their faith in silence, prayed behind locked doors, and taught their sons and daughters to never speak what they truly believed. Generations passed, and the fear became instinct, a quiet tremor beneath every conversation, a watchfulness in every eye. Even after the Church formally ended the tribunals, something unseen continued. In the late 19th century, when scholars began to catalog the surviving records, strange reports surfaced. Archivists complained of unease of hearing pages turn in empty rooms, feeling breath against their necks as they read confessions centuries old. Some refused to work after dusk. Others went mad trying to decipher documents written in languages that seemed to shift under candlelight. One archivist, Father Ruiz, wrote in his diary, "These words are alive. They listen." The diary was found beside his body. He had burned every page of the records he'd been assigned to preserve. What was he afraid of? Perhaps it wasn't ghosts. But guilt, the collective guilt of a civilization that built its faith upon suffering and called it righteousness. For every torch that burned a heretic, a shadow was cast on the soul of humanity itself. The 20th century came, and with it, new inquisitions, political, ideological, technological. No longer draped in robes, the inquisitors wore uniforms and carried flags. They spoke not of heresy, but of purity, loyalty, and order. Yet the pattern was the same: interrogations, confessions, extermination. We learned nothing. We only changed the names. But something else survived too. The archives. Hidden beneath Vatican vaults, beneath Spanish cathedrals, beneath the ruins of old monasteries swallowed by time. There are still rooms sealed behind false walls. Some historians say they contain records too dangerous to release, confessions of priests who saw visions, relics said to defy nature, testimonies that question the very foundation of faith. And sometimes, under strict permission, a scholar is allowed to enter for research. They are never left alone, never without a watcher. One such scholar, in 1972, claimed to have seen a chamber marked only with a symbol, circle pierced by a cross. Inside, she said, were hundreds of preserved parchments, each one covered in names written backward, as if to undo the identity of those they condemned. When she asked what they meant, her escort told her softly, "They are the ones we erased." She never spoke of it again. What truth was so terrifying it could not be forgotten, yet could never be revealed? Today tourists walk through the plazas where pyres once burned, taking pictures where ashes once fell. They smile, unaware that beneath their feet the earth remembers. The soil is rich, they're not just with history, but with blood. When the wind sweeps across Seville at dusk, The air carries a strange scent, a mingling of incense and smoke, as if the city itself still breathes its confession. History tells us the Inquisition ended long ago. The power never ends, it only finds new robes to wear. Every time a voice is silenced, every time truth is bound in chains of fear, the Inquisition is reborn. Not in the church, but in us. Because the true terror of the Inquisition was never its fire. It was its idea that righteousness justifies cruelty, that purity is worth pain, that faith can excuse fear. And that idea still walks among us, whispering in the halls of power, smiling through modern masks, waiting for the moment humanity forgets what the fire once felt like. So when you hear a bell toll in the distance, listen closely. It may not be calling the faithful, it may be calling the fearful. For the Inquisition was not destroyed, it merely changed its name. The smoke rises. Again, not from the pyres of heretics, but from the quiet fires we light in our own hearts. The world turns, the robes change, the tongues evolve, but the hunger for control still watches from the dark. They say the Inquisition ended. But listen, every time we fear the truth, every time we burn the voice that questions, the flame is reborn. Somewhere beneath centuries of dust and silence, a bell still tolls for the condemned. Its echo drifts through time, calling not to the guilty, but to the forgetful. Because the greatest sin of all is to believe that it could never happen again. And in that silence after the final bell, the whisper returns, soft, patient, eternal. Confess.